But now we are going to continue our series of sermons, our summer sermon series on Exodus. And we've made quite a bit of progress in this summer. We are on Exodus 32. And actually, we're just going to stay on this one chapter today. You know, the last couple of weeks we've gone through 5 or 10 chapters at a time. Now we're just in one chapter, and I'm sure that you're very familiar with the story. This is a story, of course, we've been following Moses as he's been leading the Hebrews through the wilderness for quite some time now. And they are going towards the promised land, but this would be a long journey. And they had camped at Mount Sinai, and Moses had gone up to receive the law. The last 2 sermons we've been talking about the law, and this is what's been going on. And today, no different. Moses is still up at Mount Sinai, receiving words from God, and it's been a long time. It's been 40 days, give or take. But basically it's been a long time. It's been over a month, and so the people, you have to remember, the people down below at the base of the mountain, they don't know what's going on up there. They don't know what happened to Moses. For all they know, he could be dead, because you may remember that they believed it was literally dangerous, that it was life-threatening to be close to God. And so if you got too close or you saw God's presence, you would surely die. And so they, seemed that this was an exception with Moses, but maybe not. He's been up there for over a month, so maybe he did die. Now, it's not that they're going to go up there and try to find out. For one thing, I'm sure it's not easy ascending this mountain. But secondly, what are you going to do if God is still there and then you find yourself there? You could die too. So it's really just kind of a wait-and-see approach, waiting to see when and if Moses comes down. But in the meanwhile, they are worried, they are anxious, because they have no leader now. They have no leader. And so they tell Aaron, Moses' brother, they say, make us gods that we can worship. We need a God, we need a visual representation of God. We need something to worship. And so Aaron, interestingly enough, this is always a confusing part of the story to me, but Aaron just goes right along with it. But again, we don't know what all has transpired in these past 40 days. But, Aaron may have been at his wit's end. But whatever the case is, Aaron asks for the gold, any gold that they have, and so they fashion this calf out of this gold. And then they are going to have a festival the next day. So Aaron must be all in. And so they have a festival the next day where they're sacrificing and they're reveling, as it puts it, and it's just going wild. Just a wild party. So meanwhile, Moses is up on top of the mountain, and God informs him of what's going on down there. And God says, Moses, I have the solution. I'm going to kill them all. That's the solution. I'm going to kill them all, and I'm going to start over with you. And so Moses doesn't think that that's very good. He doesn't think that that's a great idea. And so Moses intercedes. He prays. That's what it means to talk to God, is to pray. And so he intercedes on behalf of the people, and he says, now wait a minute. Now, before you go kill them all off and start over, you have to think about your reputation. You have to think about what other people are going to think. The Egyptians that you just showed who's boss when you let these people go, what are they going to think if they hear that you just led them into the wilderness to kill them? You got to think, God, what are others going to think? You got to keep your reputation up. That's number one. Number two, you got to remember your promise. Remember, God, you made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and me, by the way, that you are going to create many, many people out of their descendants, and that you're going to bless the world. And so remember your promise. And so God repents. God changes his mind. That's what repenting means, is to change your mind, to change direction. And God says he's not going to kill the people. So Moses comes down from the mountain, and indeed, this is what he finds. He finds this party, he finds this festival, and he then, when he sees it, he is burning hot with anger. He breaks the tablets when he drops them, signifying the fact that the people had already broken their covenant agreement with God. And then he, as it says, he grinds up this statue into powder, scatters it in the water, makes them drink it, and then he goes to Aaron and he says, what's going on? What happened here? Explain this to me, please. And Aaron says, well, they were pressuring me, and so I said, fine. So I got this gold, and then out came this calf. His version is a little different. So, it's interesting that Aaron doesn't really get a big punishment there, but nonetheless, things go from bad to worse, because then, we didn't read the whole thing, but after that point, Moses says to the people, choose sides. Who's with me and who's not? And so those from the tribe of Levi sided with Moses. So the Levites side with him, and then they are given swords, and they are told to go forth and start killing. So I guess Moses maybe decided that maybe God's original solution was okay. I don't know. But he tells the Levites to go forth and start killing the people. Kill your own family. Kill these people, because they're all family, And so they go forth and they end up killing 3,000 people. And then, after that, evidently they have control of the situation, and Moses intercedes again on behalf of the people to God, asking God, please forgive these people for what they have done. If you won't forgive them, then blot my name out too from your book. In other words, don't forgive me if you don't forgive them. God says, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to do that, Moses. I'm not going to blot your name out, but I'm not going to forgive them either. They will be punished for their sins. So God refuses to show mercy. He says he's going to punish them for their sins, and then he sends a plague upon them. End of the story. Not the most uplifting story in the world. Kind of a lot of really depressing when you think about it. They will find themselves in situations like this often, especially in the wilderness, but even after they form their kingdom in the promised land. So, there are a couple of things to unpack here in this story first before we go any further. Now, the first thing that we need to take a close look at is this idea that God wanted to kill everybody. This is when Moses was still up on the mountain. God wanted to kill everybody and start over with Moses. We aren't used to this idea of God being portrayed this way. Where God seems to lose his temper and he's going to do something rash, and then he has to be corrected by a human being. We're not used to the idea of God acting ungodlike and having to be corrected and shown a more Christ-like way by a human being. And so Moses is the one who says, now God, let's not be so hasty. Think about this and that. That's just jarring to us to think that God could be correctable by a human being. But in this story, God is portrayed as being very human-like, fallible. He can make mistakes. He can lose his temper. He can be rash. And sometimes he needs to be calmed down. Sometimes he needs to be talked to and corrected by a human being. And then God can repent, which is something we generally just think that we do. So this brings up a whole issue. One thing that we want to realize, though, is that just because, let's just put it this way, there are a lot of different portrayals of God in the Bible. Some of them contradict one another. They're not all the same, and you don't necessarily have to agree 100% with every portrayal of God that is given. So that's number one. But there are a couple of different ways to think about this that might help. One is the idea that God could have been testing Moses, kind of similar to the way that he is portrayed as testing Abraham when he tells him to sacrifice his son. It could be, perhaps, that God was testing Moses, that he never intended to just kill all the people and start over, but perhaps he was testing to see how Moses would reply to that. We certainly have precedent in the Bible for stories where God did this thing, not just with Abraham, but on other occasions too. So that's one possible way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that perhaps Moses just assumed that God was going to want to kill the people because of the terrible thing that they had done. And so perhaps he assumed that, and so he intercedes and prays that this not be so. Just a couple of ways to think about it. some stories in the Old Testament like this, they're not easily explainable, and so we can't give just one answer for how to think about it. But those are just a few different things to think about with that. So another thing that we need to take a look at is this idea that the Levites are given swords and are told to start killing their own people. When they do this, after they've killed 3,000 people, they are then honored as having strong faithfulness to God because they killed their own people. Which kind of flies in the face of like what Jesus teaches when he says that when we love our enemies, when we turn the other cheek, when we do not seek revenge, that we are following or reflecting our Father in heaven. Okay, so if we are like our Father in heaven when we are loving our enemies and not seeking revenge, but then in this story, the Levites are said to be strong faith in following God for killing 3,000 of their own people, then you've got some cognitive dissonance. You've got some disagreement here between these two stories or these two ways of thinking about God. And so, again, just give you a couple of things to think about to try to make sense of this. The way I see it, we have three options of how to make sense of this. One idea is that Jesus was wrong. Perhaps, I'm just playing, just explore this for a moment. Let's say that Jesus was wrong about the Father. Maybe he didn't know the Father as well as he said that he did. Maybe when he taught that when you love your enemies, you're reflecting your Father in heaven, maybe he was just flat out wrong. Because if God would it seems like so often God's go-to solution in the early stories of the Bible is violence and death and mayhem. And so maybe Jesus was just wrong. If that's the way the Father works, then loving our enemies is not being like our Father. Seeking revenge, it would be being like our Father. So perhaps Jesus just really didn't know the Father very well. Another solution, another possibility, is that perhaps Moses was wrong. Perhaps Moses did not know the Father clearly, or as clearly as Jesus did. And perhaps Moses thought that this was the best solution, that this was the only solution that he saw, was to get control of the situation by starting to kill people. And perhaps he thought that that's what God wanted, but perhaps he was wrong. That's another possibility. A third possibility is that perhaps God changes a whole lot depending on the situation and the mood and the age. There are many who believe that God changes depending on the age of history that we're in. And back then we were under the age of the law, now we're under the age of grace, and God operates differently. So, according to this option, God is not the same yesterday, today, and forever, but he changes so drastically in the way that he handles things that God becomes untrustworthy and unpredictable, almost like an abusive parent. So you've got, these are the three options. Maybe there's more that I'm not thinking of, but those are the three options that I think of for handling this story. Now, I tend to hesitate to say that God changes so much that he's unpredictable. I also hesitate to say that Jesus was wrong and didn't know the Father because I am Christian, and I follow Christ. And so I tend to say that perhaps Moses was wrong. As I said last week in last week's message, Jesus, when he talked about the law, actually I think it was 2 weeks ago, when he talked about the law, he mentioned the fact that Moses said this, but I say this. In other words, Jesus was acknowledging that Moses saw God partially, but not as fully as Jesus did. And so perhaps Moses saw God, but he just didn't have as clear of a picture as Jesus did, and therefore he could be mistaken at times. I tend to lean towards that view. I don't know for sure, but that's one way to think about this part of the story. Last thing we want to unpack in this story is the idea that God refused to forgive them of their sins, that instead he would send a plague to punish them for their sins. This is especially relevant to us today with the pandemic. And I have always been adamant that God does not send plagues to punish people for their sins. And that when it says in the Bible that God sends a plague to punish people for their sins, That reflects more how the people thought about God rather than how God actually was. And, we have to think about this. When we look at the scriptures, there are two parts to interpreting the Bible. First, you have to look at what the people back then were trying to communicate and why they were trying to communicate it in their own way. And then we have to look at how it applies today. How is God speaking to us today through that passage? So 2 parts, back then and today. And we have to remember that this is a very ancient book written by very ancient people, to very ancient people, living in ancient times with a very ancient worldview of the universe. Keyword, ancient. Long time ago. And we have to respect that distance when we're trying to make sense of the Bible. And so we have to take off our 21st century glasses when we read the Bible, when we're trying to understand what they're communicating back then. Because we have to kind of try, we can't do it perfectly, but try to take ourselves out of all of our modern assumptions about the way the world works and everything. Forget for a moment that there are germs. It's hard to believe, especially now. But forget for the moment that there are germs and that you have any idea about what causes any kind of sickness. Take off your 21st century glasses, and when you read the story, it makes sense why they would automatically say that a plague was sent by God to punish people for their sins, because there is no concept of any other thing. When things happen in the world that were unexplainable, whether it was good or bad, it was attributed to God because they didn't have any other option. And so when we take off our modern assumptions, we can see why they would say that and why that would make sense. In fact, this is the way we've operated for most of history before the rise of some of the different sciences. The bubonic plague was a plague that many people many people said that was sent by God's divine wrath to forgive people, I'm saying this wrong, that the bubonic plague was sent by God's divine wrath to punish people for their sins. And so many people were blamed, a lot of bad things were done. But as it turned out, it wasn't sent by God's divine wrath to punish sinners. It was actually just rat fleas. Whoops. That's very different, isn't it? But when you get an idea of germs and just how things spread and how everything works, it changes things. And we also realize that, with any plague, with any pandemic, it's more complicated than just the bad guys die, But it affects everyone, as we know today more than ever. And so it makes sense when we take off our 21st century glasses to look at why they did things the way that they did. Then, when we have to put them back on, we have to put all of our 21st century assumptions back on when we look at how we apply it today. Right? If we don't do those 2 things, taking them off to look at what they were saying then and putting them back on to see what it means for us today, we get into trouble. So, for instance, if we don't do those things, then we can look at these scriptures and we can say, if they said that God sent a plague to punish people for their sins, then that must have been what happened. Therefore, that means that God can still send plagues to punish people for their sins. Therefore, it is a possibility that the coronavirus was sent to punish people for their sins. You see what we're saying here? We're assuming that they know all about germs and all these other things, so it must be from God. And therefore, we then don't even put our 21st century glasses back on to say, perhaps there's another reason. Or another example, another thing that we might do is we might say, back then they believed that if you were righteous and you followed God and you had a strong faith, that you would be protected. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. That whole idea that was challenged in the book of Job. Many people believed that they would be protected from bad things and plagues if they did what was right. And if a plague happened to them, they must have done something wrong. And so, therefore, some people are believing that if they just have a strong faith and if they follow God, they will be protected. And if they go to church, then they'll be protected in church, because surely God would not infect them for going to church. Again, this comes from the idea of not taking off our assumptions when we look at the text in the beginning. And then especially once we see what they're trying to say, then we have to put on our 21st century assumptions when we apply it today. And we say, just because they thought that then doesn't mean that that's how the world works, because we know that it doesn't, right? But we can get ourselves into trouble when we don't do those two things. Let go of our assumptions to try to understand what they were saying then. Come back to the modern world when we try to figure out how it applies today. So, let's look at this story. What is going on with this story? Well, as I said, the people were anxious. Moses was gone. See, these people, we'll take off our 21st century glasses for a second, and we'll take a look at how they would have been feeling and what they would have been thinking. These people at the base of the mountain, they don't know what's happened to Moses. But what we do know is that they are used to having visual representations of gods. They're used to all these other religions that have statues and idols and images of gods to worship. And now there's this newfangled religion where they say you're not supposed to have images, you're not supposed to have idols, you're not supposed to have statues. And that's hard, that's a hard adjustment, but at least they have Moses. And Moses is kind of like a representative of God because he's the one who talks to God, so he's kind of serves as that for them. But now they don't know where Moses is. He could be dead for all that they know. So now they're just abandoned. What are they going to do? And so when they are in this time of anxiety, they want to go back to the familiar. They want to go back to what they know. They want to go back to the familiar. And so they desire to have a physical representation of the God who brought them out of Egypt. Most scholars believe that they didn't actually think that the golden calf actually freed them from slavery, or that they believed that the golden calf was actually in and of itself a god, but that it was a physical representation or a manifestation of that God. And so they said, therefore, this is the representation of the God that brought you out of Egypt. It gave them something to worship. It was something that was familiar. But still, it was a serious thing because it is a breach of their covenant with God. And so this is a very serious thing. I don't know if it's worth killing 3,000 people over, but it's still a very serious thing. But they wanted to go back to the familiar. Many times in their wilderness journeys, they would say, we want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to the way things were before, because at least we were taken care of there. At least we had food and work. And at least one time, they will try to make plans to return to Egypt as well. And, we're going through our own wilderness time here. And this has been the whole theme of this entire series, so you've heard this a lot from me. But we're going through our own wilderness time. When people experience a lot of change, there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a desire to go back to the familiar. And that was true for them as well. They had experienced a ton of change. 400 years of slavery, and then all of a sudden this. That's a lot of change. And so they wanted to go back to the familiar. And in the same way, when we have change, we want to go back to the familiar. Because when we are faced with a lot of change, whether it's positive or negative, it can be good change too. But whatever the change is, oftentimes we find ourselves in that in-between time where we are no longer in the comfort of what was, but we're also not yet on the other side of the change into the realization of what will be. And so that in-between time is uncomfortable. So we want to go to one or the other, and if we don't feel like the other side of it is that close, then we feel like we want to go back to the way things were. So, we want to go back to Egypt. We're tired of this. We're tired of the pandemic. We're tired of all this and having to live this way and do the things the way that we're doing them. And we don't want to do it anymore. So we want to go back to Egypt. In other words, we want to go back to the way things were before there was a pandemic. Some people already are. Some people are already acting that way, as though it isn't real. But we can't go back. We can't go back to the way it was before any more than the Israelites could go back to Egypt. It wasn't practical. They have to continue where they are. And they have to continue journeying through the wilderness. They'd like to either skip back or skip ahead, and we also want to do that. Either skip back or skip ahead, but to get through this. They wanted to get through it too. And when they were in their wilderness time, they needed a reminder that God was with them. They needed some kind of something to give them a sense that they are not abandoned and that they are not alone. And so they went to this golden calf as a reminder that there was a God who was with them, and that they were not alone, and that they were going to be okay. So, and a bull or a calf makes sense because that was a very, very common image for religious idols in those days. So when we take off our 21st century glasses, we can see it actually makes sense. At first we're like, well, how can they do that? How can they think that a golden calf freed them from slavery? Please. But when we remove ourselves from our current context and we enter their world, we can see why maybe it makes a little more sense. They're just needing reassurance. They're needing a sense that they're not alone. And it's still a serious offense, don't get me wrong. It's still a serious offense what they did. But maybe we can make sense of it a little more. And then we can put our 21st century glasses back on, and we can look at our own situation, and we can say that we're going through some similar things. And it could be tempting to want to go back, or to ignore, or to just put our head in the sand, whatever. But what we are really wanting or needing is a reminder that God is with us, that we're not abandoned, that we're not alone, and that God is leading us through. And so may this be a reminder to you. As I said, we don't have visual representations of God, but may you remember that God is with you always, that God is continuing to lead you through the wilderness, just as God ultimately did not abandon his people, but continued to lead them through the wilderness into the promised land. And in the same way, God will lead us through this wilderness and to the other side, when we can look back and see this as a part of history. God will lead us through and see us to the other side.